Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Today I wanted to continue a series looking at the 10 mechanics that you can block on the Atlas. All of these got substantial buffs in patch 3.20. Today's episode is going to be looking at Metamorph and all the support that's available on the Atlas passive tree for this mechanic that was first introduced way back in patch 3.9. Now it's going to take you 55 Atlas passive points if you want to allocate everything that is available on the passive tree that's related to Metamorph in some way, and this includes all the necessary travel. In practice, there's a few points you won't want to take, and we'll get to what those are in a sec. However, it's also worth noting that if you do allocate all of these nodes on your tree, you will be in a very good place to synergize with a few other specific mechanics. You'll be extremely close on the Atlas passive tree to Incursion and Essence nodes. In fact, you'll be so close to them that you can allocate every single Incursion node and every single Essence node with no travel at all. You can also take all the Heist nodes with a very small total amount of travel nodes. So those four mechanics work really well together, but you're also close to Blight, you're close to Delirium, and so you've got lots of other options as well. And really what you can do is pick a couple of mechanics on the left-hand side that you like the most, and you can run those. Now, before we go through the nodes that exist for Metamorph, I think it's worth saying something about Metamorph's core identity. It's about deadly fights, it's about catalysts, and it's about rare currency. Metamorph encounters are going to drop a moderate amount of Divine Orbs and comparably rare currencies like Annuls and Exalts and the like, but Divines are probably the one you care the most about. And also Metamorph encounters are back in their position as the best source of catalysts in the game. For a number of leagues, the best source of catalysts was either Delirium or Heist content. That's no longer the case, and Metamorph has taken it over. Metamorph allows you to build a boss each map, which will take components potentially from the map boss, and also take abilities from other trash monsters you fought throughout the map, put them together into some Frankenstein's monster, and then fight it, kill it, and take its loot. Or alternately, wind up going splat trying. All that said, other than catalysts, Metamorph feels a lot like Legion in the sense that it gives you a diverse suite of different loot from across the game, but a little bit less of it than Legion gives you. Now, Metamorph monsters drop two types of loot. There's what we term reward tile loot, which is the loot that you select from the menu when you're building your Metamorph. This is going to make up about 95% of the value of the loot that you get from Metamorph encounters. Then there's the items that are directly dropped from the Metamorph monster itself, and these will only make up about 5%. Now, this mechanic is very hardcore unfriendly and very bad for XP. A number of the bosses that you'll encounter in maps, and also a number of specific rare monsters, have abilities that can be really deadly on a Metamorph, and also ones that you might not think of. For instance, what is the most dangerous map boss in the game to make a Metamorph out of? You're probably thinking one of the genuinely dangerous bosses with a large area of effect ability, something like the Guardian of the Hydra or Kaj ILI from Vaal Temple. You'd be wrong. It is Salangzarang from the Gardens map. The boss of the Gardens map is the single most dangerous thing you can put into a Metamorph. That's really not obvious, and this is because some mechanics like Salangzarang suppressing fire are extraordinarily dangerous when they come from a different monster to the monster that's originally intended to have them. So with that in mind, don't run Metamorph if you're concerned about experience gain, don't run it if you're in hardcore, unless it's in a very, very controlled environment. Metamorph is also somewhat tier sensitive, but in a different way to a lot of other mechanics. A lot of mechanics tend to be pretty bad in white tier and yellow tier maps, then pretty good in red tier maps. Metamorph bucks this trend a bit. It's pretty bad in white tier maps. It's actually pretty good in yellow tier maps, and it gets slightly better in red tier maps, but not by very much. Metamorph Scarabs are cheap, and this is going to be important when we start looking at Intrinsic Darkness, this first cluster. This is going to change your approach to the mechanic, because it means that you are going to want to be using polished or gilded Metamorph Scarabs on most of your maps if you're heavily invested into the Metamorph mechanic. And once you're using those Scarabs, you actually gain absolutely nothing from X% chance for your maps to contain a Metamorph encounter. So keep this one in mind. Gilded Scarabs are better than polished Scarabs by enough that in my opinion it is worth trading for them. At the time I'm recording this video, Gilded Scarabs in bulk for Metamorph cost about 5.5 to 6 Chaos Orbs in 3.20. Every time a new video gets made talking up a particular strategy, you find that the Scarabs related to that do tend to go up, but even if they go up to 8C, I think they're still a great buy. Polished Scarabs are fine, they're only a third of the price, and they're meaningfully better than Rusted Scarabs, so when you do have Rusted Scarabs, at least at current market values, I would just suggest 3-for-1ing them into Polished Scarabs, because you will get better value running your maps with Polished Scarabs and just buying new Scarabs when you need to. The final general point we need to make is that Tane's lab is a very important point of the Metamorph loop. These encounters are worth doing and they drop raw Divine Orbs reasonably often. But if you do the in-map Metamorph events without any strategy, you'll find yourself starved for certain components when you go to actually run your metamorphs in the lab. You might find that you've got 27 brains and only 3 lungs. At this point, you're going to need to go and farm lungs. The way that you farm a specific organ when you need it is you run a map that has multiple bosses. City Square is the best map for Metamorph, but Strand works as well. Just pick anything you like that intrinsically has at least 2 and ideally 3 bosses on it, and then run your Metamorphs there. When you have the option to select one of the organ you're missing, so in this case you need more lungs, select the boss lung, and then in the other slots do not select anything that is from the boss. If you do this, you'll be guaranteed to get 1, 2, or more itemized lungs, depending upon the total number of itemized organs that drop. However, it's not worth passing up a good reward. So if you've got a good reward, like contains a valuable gem, or contains valuable currency shards, or contains a 6-linked unique chest piece, then in that case, you're going to want to take that reward instead, and miss out on your Tane's Metamorph for the moment. You'll have plenty more chances to assemble the particular organs you need in order to fight in Tane's lab again. Okay, so let's go through the clusters. Firstly, we have Intrinsic Darkness in the southwest. Now this grants 22% Metamorph chance. This is a trap late game. This is really good early on when you don't yet have a Scarab pool established, and it does have some utility in solo self-found. So if you're in solo self-found, or if you're just establishing a Scarab pool at the start of a league, then yeah, by all means pick Intrinsic Darkness, but do so with the intention of unspecking it. But later on, once you've got plenty of Scarabs, unspec these points, spend them on something else on your tree that achieves something for you, and use a polished Scarab on every map while you're running Metamorphs. Additionally, you'll notice that if you take Wandering Path, this cluster becomes better. However, I don't recommend Wandering Path in conjunction with Metamorph at all, because you'll miss out on Organ Donor, you'll miss out on replicated results, you'll miss out on too many good things, and as a result, I can't recommend that, even though it would make this narrow cluster better. Okay, so the next cluster is the Outer West cluster. This contains Wealth of Knowledge and Unethical Experiments. Wealth of Knowledge is one of the least documented and most frequently misunderstood nodes on the entire Atlas passive tree. This is a serviceable node, but it's not particularly great. Let's go through what it does. Remember how we were talking about how 95% of your loot is the reward tiles, 5% is the loot that the Metamorph as a monster inherently drops? This makes that 5% much better. And it is actually much better. I'll put up a screenshot now of a proc where Metamorphs in your maps have a random modifier to dropped items actually triggered. And you'll see here that all of the items that were dropped by the Metamorph itself have had their sockets bleached. So all of those have white sockets, but all the drops that came from reward icons were not socket bleached. That's how you can tell what Wealth of Knowledge does. It upgrades the items that are dropped by the Metamorph monster itself, that 5% of the loot that you're getting, and it can upgrade them quite a bit sometimes if you get very lucky. But in practice, most of these modifiers are not all that impactful. Sometimes the items will drop corrupted, sometimes they'll drop identified with a mirrored copy, and sometimes they'll drop with maximum sockets. Probably the ones that you care most about later in the game are when you get a Scarab conversion. This will convert anything that would have been a unique item into a winged Scarab, anything that would have been a rare item into a gilded Scarab, and anything that would have been a magic item into a polished Scarab. This one's okay. In fact, this one's pretty exciting to see. You'll get a big fountain of Scarabs, but this is very, very rare. I've not personally had this, I just know that it can drop. The other one that's much more common, and that is actually quite good when you get it, is when you get the outcome that vendors all the items that drop, and then multiplies them by between 5 and 25. When this happens, you'll sometimes see a very, very, very large number of Jeweler's Orbs. This means that you had a 6-socket item drop, the game vended it for you for 7 Jeweler's Orbs, and then gave you between 5 and 25 times that amount of Jeweler's Orbs, which ends up being fairly impactful when you get like 8 stacks of Jeweler's Orbs from one particular monster. You also get quantity and rarity bonuses here on Wealth of Knowledge. Again, these only apply to the Metamorph monster itself. And 250% increased quantity of items sounds like a lot, but this just stacks additively with what the Metamorph already had by virtue of being a unique monster. When you make a monster of a Metamorph that has 5 mods on it, this is not going to give you 13.5 times the loot you otherwise would have got. So it's not nearly as good as it sounds. Something that's really interesting about this cluster though is the small nodes are quite good. Monsters in your maps that drop Metamorph organs have a 10% chance to upgrade their rarity. This is going to mean that you'll have more magic, rare, and unique organs, which then means that you will fill up your bar by more, and the more that you fill up the vat, the more loot that you will end up getting, because you'll start getting duplication of loot. So these mods are actually really good. On the other side of the fork, there are 2 small nodes that reduce the amount of juice that's required in order to fill up your Metamorph vat. Now, this is okay. 10% reduced power to fill is okay to have there, but it's nothing stellar unless you are in exactly yellow tier maps. If you're in white tier maps, this probably isn't enough anyway, and also the organs that you get for filling up the bar aren't all that impactful. But if you're in yellow tier maps, this is actually quite a boost. It'll mean that you'll have a lot more flexibility to avoid particularly obnoxious metamorph mods, and that can make the encounters a bit easier. Finally, we have Unethical Experiments, which grants a tremendous increase to experience. But remember what we said about Metamorph being rippy. Basically, the XP here is completely dead because you are just going to die a lot when you're running Metamorphs, unless you are dropping back multiple tiers from what you're capable of, because Metamorphs are unpredictable and they are very dangerous and they attack on a bunch of axes that you're probably not expecting. Additionally, the Scarab sustain is something. It's not absolutely nothing, but it's just not all that impactful. Like, yeah, every now and again you'll get an extra Scarab, but that's not a huge deal. And ultimately, I think that Unethical Experiments is one of the weaker of the large nodes on the tree. However, in solo self-found, where you don't have the option of just trading for more Scarabs, this is worth taking anyway, just for that Scarab sustain. So next we have the Inner West Pincers cluster. Now this contains Organ Donor and Replicated Results. These are two of the reasons that you are running Metamorph. So Organ Donor single-handedly brings Tane's Lab from okay to great. The nodes that lead up to it do nothing again in reds. This is 10% reduced power required to fill the VAT meter, but are pretty good in yellow tier maps where you might not always fill a VAT meter. Replicated Results is the single most important Metamorph node on the entire tree. This doesn't quite double a loot, and that's because the second Metamorph will be quite a bit worse than the first one was. That's because you'll have used all of your best rewards on the first one, and then you'll have less of them available for the second. However, it's still pretty good. Additionally, we have some of the weirdest small nodes here. These additional Metamorph sample rewards are very, very good if you are running Rusted Scarabs, Polished Scarabs, or no Scarabs. And they do absolutely nothing if you are running Gilded or Winged Scarabs for your Metamorphs. The reason for that is that Gilded and Winged max you out on this particular stat. So +1 Metamorph monster samples in your maps have rewards, while Gilded Scarabs apply an absolute maximum to this to every monster sample in your map has rewards. And as a result, you don't gain anything more from these nodes with a Gilded Scarab. However, you're going to want to take Replicated Results anyway, and so if you take these 3 points as one package, you're going to be pretty happy with that package if you're using a Gilded Metamorph Scarab on every map, even though these two nodes do absolutely nothing for you. Now, something that's important, you might want to connect differently to how I have here. You could connect through here and then drop these 2 points. These 2 points just give you percentage chance to have a Metamorph encounter. And as we were discussing, because you're probably going to want to use Scarabs all the time, Metamorph Scarabs both being cheap and being very good, you're probably going to want to do that rather than take those points. If you are a Scarab user, then this is probably the optimal approach. And that gets us down to only 54 points invested in Metamorph, but you're also going to drop these 5 points off as well. And now we're suddenly looking at 49 points invested. Okay, so next we have the first of the two Northwest clusters. This one has Catalysing Fluids and Escaped Experiment. Escaped Experiment's an interesting node. We'll come back to it in a sec. Let's start with Catalysing Fluids. This is great. With so few people focusing on Metamorph in 320, this is going to add an extra 2 catalysts or so per map, and this really does add up because catalysts are probably the highest price I've seen them in any recent league. You can also get the Catalyst, a duplicated Sextant modifier, rolled really cheaply as well. This might not remain the case because at the moment it's very cheap, but it's the sort of thing that can easily spike in price if a few people start buying it. But at the time I'm recording this video, you can get them in bulk for 7 chaos per 4 use Sextant. So this is one of those things that is just constant income while you're using it, and will definitely add up. Then we have Escaped Experiment, which is a complete oddball node. Never, ever, ever take this in hardcore. 2 reasons for this. The first one is that it removes your agency in when to spawn a Metamorph, and secondly, it removes your agency over what specific organs you never, ever use. Remember we were talking about how Salangzarang in Gardens map is extremely, extremely dangerous? Well, you might just find out that that Escaped Experiment is based upon Salangzarang. And the way you'll find that out is because the Suppressing Fire ability will kill you. That's why you don't want this node in hardcore. But if you're in softcore, this is something you can definitely take. Just be aware that it is going to be an XP killer. The other thing is that you can't control the range of engagement with Escaped Experiment. You're going to be engaging this Metamorph at a fairly long range because that's where it's going to spawn. And some of them have pretty dangerous abilities at long range that can fire in ways you don't necessarily expect. So Escaped Experiment is a loot increaser, but very, very, very dangerous and will attack your defenses in ways you aren't expecting. You also might want to path differently here. Specifically, you probably don't want to take both of these small nodes, and that's because 4% chance to contain a Metamorph encounter is pretty much a dead stat once you start using Scarabs all the time. That's one of the things I don't like about this cluster. There's 16% of that stat here, takes up 4 of your small nodes, and it does absolutely nothing for you. That said, Catalysing Fluids makes up for it, it's very good, and Escaped Experiment is pretty solid too. Finally, we have the second Northwest cluster. So this is the one that gives you agency over the difficulty of your Metamorph encounters. You can allocate Fine Specimens if you want Metamorphs to kill you even more than they otherwise do, and you can allocate Imperfect Anatomy if you want them to be easier. Imperfect Anatomy is actually better than a lot of these nodes usually are. So even on a powerhouse character, Metamorphs are unpredictable, they do really surprising things. If you allocate Imperfect Anatomy, then you're going to have considerably less damage on your Metamorphs. Additionally, they're going to have reduced action speed. I like to think of this combination of 3 nodes as being akin to having a Temporal Chains on the monster and also an Enfeeble on the monster. Of course, stacking with Temporal Chains or Enfeeble if you supply them yourself. This ends up being pretty significant, especially given that these monsters are so unpredictable, and I actually really like these 3 points. On the flip side, Fine Specimens is really dangerous, but really lucrative if you can pull it off. Metamorphs in your maps deal 15% more damage on a monster type that is already very dangerous is really, really rippy. You'll find that they can really tear through you, and they can do damage in ways you don't necessarily expect. Sometimes there'll be a rare monster that has an ability that isn't very dangerous because the base monster isn't very scary, but when it's on a big powerful monster like a Metamorph, it can do a lot of damage, and then with Fine Specimens, it can then one-shot you. However, in exchange for this, and also for the monsters taking 2.5 times as long to kill, you're going to have a 30% chance for rewards from your Metamorphs to be doubled. Now this only applies to those reward tiles, this does not apply to the base loot of the monster, and so it doesn't synergize all that well with the bonuses to base loot from Wealth of Knowledge, but it's still pretty good, and it is a doubling of the most important part of the loot. Additionally, you get more of this duplication stat here and here, so you'll end up with a total of 39% chance for your Metamorphs to duplicate their rewards, which is pretty substantial and something you really want to take. Ultimately, I think Fine Specimens will come down to, do you prefer mapping in tier 10s with Fine Specimens or tier 16s without it? I think you'll find that the Metamorphs are comparably dangerous in both, and I think you'll find the rewards are comparable. But once your character is super powerful, then you can just go into tier 16s with Fine Specimens. Maybe you'll eat the odd death here and there, but you will get a lot of rewards out of doing so. Okay, let's just have some final points talking about some of the nodes that totally transform the entire Atlas. Firstly, Growing Hordes. No, we don't want to use Growing Hordes here because Metamorph Scarabs are so good that nothing Growing Hordes gives you makes up for the loss of Metamorph Scarabs. Secondly, Wandering Path. No. We do not want to use this because Wandering Path is going to kill off Organ Donor, is going to kill off Replicated Results, and these two are such a big part of the loot that you get from Metamorph that it is definitely not worth your while. Even though it's nice to get a boost to these values, ultimately the drawbacks from Wandering Path exceed the bonuses, and so I cannot recommend taking that node. So now that we've gone through the 2 Atlas warping nodes that you definitely don't want to take, let's talk about the one that you might consider, and that's Grand Design. Now, Grand Design makes your Metamorph support on your Atlas worse. Grand Design causes the small Atlas passive skills to grant nothing, and it causes your maps to have plus 1% pack size for every allocated notable Atlas passive. This doesn't improve Metamorph in any noticeable way, but it does make it worse. You'll miss out on a couple of things you care about, like 3% chance for rewards for Metamorphs in your maps to be doubled. However, if the rest of your Atlas wants Grand Design, you are not sabotaging the Metamorph nodes all that much by taking it. A lot of the small nodes are actually wasted stats anyway, 4% chance to have a Metamorph encounter, or for those of you that are using Gilded Scarabs, plus 1 Metamorph monster samples in your maps have rewards. These stats do absolutely nothing with Gilded Scarabs, and as a result, you can definitely consider using Grand Design. It will mean that the points that you invest into Metamorph support on your Atlas will get slightly less bang for their buck, but if the rest of your Atlas needs it, you're not really sabotaging things much by doing this, and you might get paid off for that elsewhere. So Grand Design is okay to pair with Metamorph. It makes the Metamorph things a bit worse, but not by all that much. Anyways, that's all I got on this. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results, and I will see you around.